Several years ago, a kayaker, a younger man, came to Elizabeth City just before Christmas, stashed his kayak near the Pasquotank River until he could return for it later that day. He then drove his truck down to Morehead City and left it in that more southerly port, locking his wallet, money, ID, and all in the glove box, then catching a northbound bus back up to Elizabeth City where he could begin his real adventure. Near the Narrows at Elizabeth City, where the Black River turns in a horseshoe bend, the kayaker put in and made his late afternoon way down toward the mouth of the Pasquotank, where it joins the legendarily rough waters of the Albemarle Sound. It was late, and he'd had a full day, so he looked for a downriver spot to camp, finding one on shore within sight of a small cruising boat that was anchored out. In the morning, he took off, passing the anchored craft, the confident north wind at his back as he skipped and skittered along toward God's own open waters. And then, much as he was enjoying himself near the beginning of his 10 or 12 mile crossing toward the mouth of Alligator River, he dumped. Off went the kayak, still on holiday, without him. Even in his sleek, efficient craft, the kayaker had only gone so far before this misfortune befell him. He was still within sight of the anchored cruiser, and so swam for it, the rising wind and waters running hard at him, and only after a long, hard time did he near the cruiser. The pair aboard, a man and woman, were ready for him. They had been watching his southerly progress, his swamping, and his swimming back their way in distress. Certainly they should have fired up their engine and gone to his aid, and they would have too, were they not stuck on this sandbar as they had been for a day and a night. When the swimming kayaker reached the cruiser, the boaters pulled him in, helped his hypothermic self best they could, and then called the Coast Guard. When the boaters called the Coast Guard, they were doing so for the second time in 24 hours. They had already made an appeal the previous day, but the Coast Guard, having ascertained that the boaters were safe, though stuck, couldn't come out on a mere grounding, and thus left the boaters and their craft high, though not dry. The kayaker, after all, had judged them to be anchored. This time, though, they had a genuine emergency. The kayaker was suffering from exposure. The Coast Guard must come. A copter appeared at once. The Coast Guard air station was less than 5 miles upriver. The airman dropped a rescue line and lifted the kayaker into the copter, and in the process, the prop wash felicitously blew the cruising boat off the shoal where it had sat forlornly and set it free into churning and bombastic winter waters, mind, but still free. Upriver to the hospital flew the copter carrying the near-frozen kayaker, and because he had nothing other than his blanket and shrouded self, no wallet, no identification, certainly no money nor insurance card, to the emergency room where the medics were thawing him out came the hospital's patient's advocate. She sized him up, literally. The first thing he would need once he re-arrived at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit would be clothes. For the kayaker's dry clothing, though safe, was somewhere inaccessible way downriver. Where does one shop for clothes on the afternoon of December 24th as it wanes there in Elizabeth City? Don't ever do this, she thought, even as she did it. I don't advise it. In the melee that was Walmart on Christmas Eve, the patient's advocate found for the kayaker the only thing in his size, a lime green jumpsuit. Then she checked him out of the hospital, got him a room at the Holiday Inn, and took him there. Then she drove home to her husband to change clothes, to go out for a traditional Christmas Eve dinner with friends. Something tugged at her, though, something decidedly uncheerful. It was the sight of the adventurer as she had left him hunkering down in his motel room, a lime green warrior, now on crusade touring the Yellow Pages, looking for rental vehicles, U-Hauls, buses, something to get him back to Morehead City, to his truck, his money, his identification on this earth. But it being Christmas Eve, with an ice storm brewing, there was nothing for rent, and no buses were running south down the Carolina coast. When she finally broke through the kayaker's cascade of hapless, hopeless outgoing calls with a call of her own, The patient's advocate found him discouraged, though comfortable, and so ventured a bit of holiday cheer by inviting him to come along to the Christmas Eve dinner and join in. Would he? He would. At dinner, the kayaker was a hit. He had the most unusual story, and he certainly had the most unusual outfit. All the folks at the table were boaters, experienced in these, their home waters, and if there be one thing that mariners love to do and must love to do, it is to speculate upon the wonders of wind and wave. Where would the kayaker's unsinkable blue kayak and his orange dry bag finally wind up? The talk flowed strong on this matter, and the boaters all agreed that this gear would most likely fetch up somewhere on the south side of Albemarle Sound, somewhere near the mouth of Alligator River, most probably on the long north shore of Durant's Island. This was all very interesting to the kayaker, though somewhat theoretical given his isolation in Elizabeth City and his separation from his truck and wherewithal down in Morehead City. Oh, a sister-in-law of the host spoke up. Is that where you need to go? Morehead's my home, and I'm driving back down in the morning once the ice has melted. Would you like a ride? Christmas Day in Carolina, and the roads were clear. The woman from the dinner party called at the Holiday Inn for the kayaker, and off they went. 3 hours later, and the pilgrim was reunited with his truck, whereupon he turned around and drove back up to Elizabeth City and began his new life as a searcher and a salver. Once he realized that he could not drive his truck to any of the spots where the dinner guests had suggested he might find his boat, his heart sank. For he also realized that the task of locating it in this big, wide, wet territory was going to require an aircraft, and he could scarcely afford to hire one for the job. A miracle was occurring, though. His story was going around Elizabeth City ahead of him, as it were. This fact of small-town life gave him pause, though, as he began to fear that word would get beyond the borders of the Sound Country and hurt his livelihood. He was a whitewater kayaking guide in the mountains. Then someone got the kayaker in touch with a pilot who worked at the Coast Guard Air Station. The pilot needed to keep his flying hours up, and he offered to take the kayaker along with him. They'd fly around for a few hours, and the pilot would only charge him for the gas they used. Now, this was a good deal, to which the kayaker agreed. When could they do this, he wondered. Well, I get off work today at noon, said the pilot. How about meeting me at the airport beside the base, say about 12:30. Up and away they flew, right down the river, and seeing nothing there, right on across the Sound, where on the north shore of Durant's Island, exactly where on the night before Christmas the dinner guests had predicted they would be, lay the blue kayak and the orange dry bag. The two men had been aloft less than 20 minutes. When the pilot returned the excited kayaker to the ground, he said, "We were hardly up any time. I'm not going to charge you for the gas after all. Go on and see about getting your boat." How would he do that, though? There were no roads to or on Durant's Island. Well, he knew that he'd have to get near it, for starters, so he lit out in his truck, driving east from Elizabeth City to Camden, Bellcross, Barco, Coin Jock, Grandy, Jarvisburg, Powell's Point, Mamie, Harbinger, Point Harbor, Kitty Hawk, Kill Devil Hills, Nag's Head, Whalebone, Manio, Mans Harbor, East Lake, which is way out yonder, where there ain't nobody never is. Especially in the dead of winter, when all the backcountry shacks and cabins are boarded up and closed. What was the kayaker thinking as he drove up the long lane to the north of US 64 toward the body of water, East Lake itself? The nearest places he could even talk to somebody about where and from whom to rent a boat were back in Mans Harbor or on over the broad 3-mile Alligator River. He didn't know what he was driving toward, only that the general direction was correct. He might or might not even get a glimpse of Durant's Island, and if he did, he'd be looking at the south side of it, the wrong side. At the end of the sandy lane there sat, as one might have expected, a cabin. The surprise was that the owners were in. When they heard the kayaker's tale, they said, "Why, take the skiff. It's all gassed up. You're just going out the cut." And not 5 minutes after he'd arrived, the kayaker was on his way again, bobbing and boating about East Lake. the legendary epicenter of white liquor making 80 years ago. Now over this same East Lake coursed the Kayaker, on out through the Shoal Thoroughfare, the Hull Over, on into Albemarle Sound, where in short order on the north shore of Durant's Island, he found his quarry, the blue kayak and orange bag, which he loaded into the skiff and headed back. By the time he made it down the north shore, through the cut at the Hull Over, back into the little creek and to the cabin, it was late that December afternoon. He got the skiff tied up, got his goods into his truck, and then turned to thank the cabin owner. And then it was that the Kayaker felt the full power of Eastern Carolina generosity and fellowship and helpfulness toward the troubled traveler. The spirit of the Albemarle was abroad in the land, for the next words he heard were these: "Found your kayak. Good, good, good. Now come on. We're just taking the first oysters off. We got a plenty, whole bushel and a half. Cooler's right over there, so get yourself something to drink. Pilgrim, you have come to the right place."